They called it the War of the Rebellion, and in the thoughts of the most eloquent leader of those times, it was fought to determine whether this nation would, in spirit and in deed, be dedicated to the proposition that all people are created equal. The last bullet fired in that great Civil War took the life of the one man who might have inspired this nation to bind its wounds, to fade its scars, and to accept the humanity of men and women of color. But it was not to be. The road to freedom has been paved with indignities, and pain, and tears, and with blood. No other race of people and no other family of immigrants has stood so long at the door, has paid so dear a price for the right to share fully in the promise of America, and suffered the cold reality of never being more than almost free. The single largest factor that brought blacks to the Arizona Territory was the U.S. Army. In 1866, there was formed the all-black 9th and 10th Cavalries, followed in 1869 by the 24th and 25th Infantries. During the 1870s, these units constituted 20% of the entire U.S. military. It was the Indians who, noting the soldiers' dark woolly hair, called them Buffalo Soldiers. Memorabilia of these units can be found at Fort Huachuca. In all, 11 black soldiers won the Congressional Medal of Honor for heroism in the Arizona Territory. Among these were Sergeant Benjamin Brown, who in a battle with a large gang of robbers near Fort Grant continued the fight, though shot in both arms and the stomach. Sergeant Isaiah Mays won the Medal of Honor in that same action for braving his way on foot through enemy lines to bring reinforcements. Later, in civilian life, Mays worked as a laborer in Phoenix. Other notable Buffalo soldiers include Sergeant George S. Thompson. Nicknamed Brass because he wasn't afraid of anything, Thompson was wounded 11 times over the course of the Apache Wars, the Spanish-American War, and the Philippine Insurrection. He died at the age of 94. Sergeant George Hammonds fought against Pancho Villa in 1916 and later operated a fuel business in Phoenix. A long military career was served by Sergeant John P. Campbell. He joined the 9th Cavalry in 1912 and saw action under General Pershing in the Mexican Border War. In Europe during World War I, he fought under the command of French officers, then continued his service in the Army Air Corps almost to the end of World War II.
Said, I want you to go to Germany with the rest of the squadron and drop some pamphlets and be back here at 6 o'clock in the morning. Moreland says, aye, aye, sir. So Moreland went over with the rest of the squadron at 6 o'clock.
What were called Negro movies of the 1930s and 40s often reflected stereotyped white attitudes of that time. In Phoenix, they were occasionally shown at the otherwise Spanish-language Ramona Theater. The Studio Theater near Central and Washington did not admit blacks at all. Others, like the Fox, the Orpheum, and the Rialto, seated blacks only in part of the balcony, known politely as colored seating, known more vulgarly as nigger heaven. Sonoma Smith remembers the day she decided to sit in the white section.
So she went and got the manager, and he came up, you're supposed to sit over there. I said, I'm very comfortable here, thank you. I just kept saying that every time. He finally left me alone because I did not create any disturbance. There was no law to segregate you in that theater or any of the other theaters. But I knew if I raised a foul, they were going to throw me out. So I just said it, and he left me alone, and I sat there and enjoyed the movie. I'm the devil when I want to be. You don't put that in there.
Separate rooms in the basement was the initial approach at Phoenix Union High School, where Sonoma Smith's mother, Myrtle Rogers, taught in what was called the colored department.
Then they moved them to across, there was a ditch there, canal, not too large, on that same ground. And they built a cottage on the other side of that. And that's because we had the number of blacks increased. So they put them over there in the cottage. Then they outgrew that because they began to come in numbers. And then they went to the Donofrio area, and they fixed it up pretty nice.
The house?
It was a house, right. And
where was that?
That was on Jefferson Street between 8th and 9th, if I remember correctly.
After a decade in makeshift facilities, the high school board spent $120,000 on land and construction at 415 East Grant, and in 1926 opened what was officially named Phoenix Colored High School. Sonoma Smith attended and later taught there. At first, Colored was operated as an extension of Phoenix Union, but in 1932, Mr. Roy A. Lee was brought in as its first full-time principal. The school was a poor relation. The school band was organized by a volunteer, Wade Hammond, a retired Army bandmaster. Field trips were allowed only at the teacher's personal expense. Dr. Morrison Warren was a star athlete.
In comparing the facilities, the academic facilities as well as the athletic facilities of the Phoenix Union High School with the Phoenix Union Colored High School, our buildings were much smaller. The athletic fields had stickers. The only uniforms that we had were hand-me-downs. The insurance resources were negligible. And I can remember commiserating about the Phoenix.
Can you imagine you go downtown with your mother, your wife, and you had an emergency to go to the toilet, and they refuse you the right to use the bathroom? All the hotels downtown would not let blacks use them. The Adams Hotel, the Westwood Hole, the San Carlos, you couldn't go in. None of the places downtown would allow you to eat or use any of the public facilities. And this was quite humiliating. And it makes you very, very angry, because you will realize, what are you fighting for? Democracy. And you have all the white German prisoners could use all these facilities, and we had to use the back door.
There had begun a national movement for civil rights, equal access for public accommodations, and it was being seen every night on the 6 o'clock news. The teachings of Mahatma Gandhi, nonviolent civil disobedience, evolved as the strategy. That was the message advocated by the emerging leader, Dr. Martin Luther King. Reverend George Brooks was a friend of King and participated with him in demonstrations in the South, where maintaining the principle of nonviolence wasn't always easy.
We were all picketing, and that hotel, the Biltmore in Atlanta, and it was my first time being struck by a white man. He hit me in the stomach, and we did nothing. And his friend says, "Come on, don't get into trouble," and he walked away. If I were in Harlem, I would have flattened him, but I was a young preacher, I couldn't do that.
In Arizona, large nonviolent demonstrations were supported by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the Urban League, the Committee on Racial Equality, and other ad hoc groups.
I guess it was enjoyable, because you were challenging the system. And you had because you're doing the right thing, it makes you feel good if you can accomplish something. Every day you could break down segregation. You could open up new opportunities. It makes you feel as though you were doing something really successful.